When the elevator doors closed behind her mother-in-law and the endless suitcases, Emma felt the familiar tug of exhaustion twist into something heavier, something almost physical. She sank to the floor of the hallway, still in her coat, her bag slung carelessly over one shoulder, staring blankly at the patterned wallpaper she had ignored for months. She didn't move. She didn't cry. Tears had long since dried up, somewhere around the third argument over the soup, years ago, leaving only a hollow, cold resignation. And yet this time was different. This time, she felt something that was neither fear nor anger. It was the raw, sharp edge of freedom she had waited for, unspoken and terrifying. Daniel stood in the middle of the room, the soft light from the hallway catching in his hair, and looked at her with that expression she had learned to read as cautiously neutral, the one that said he was judging, questioning, but trying not to take sides. He finally spoke, his voice measured. "You do realize what you just did, right?" Emma lifted her eyes, letting them linger on his face longer than she normally would, studying the faint worry lines that had deepened over the past year and a half. "My mother," he said, almost as if reciting a fact from a textbook, "just went to a hotel with her suitcases because you wouldn't let her stay here." "Yes," Emma said simply. "I know. And you're okay with that?" She felt a quiet triumph, tempered by the ache of years spent shrinking in her own home, tiptoeing around invisible lines. "It doesn't make me okay," she said slowly. "It just means I can finally breathe without waiting for something bad to happen every day." If you had met Emma at the beginning of that long, suffocating period, you would barely recognize her now. Then she would have smiled as Margaret stepped into the apartment, cheerful and concerned, and carried her bags to the spare room without a word. Then she would have offered tea, asked if her mother-in-law was tired, commented on the weather, on the traffic, on anything to fill the silence. Then she would have believed that kindness could bend a person, that patience could soften the hardest edges. But Margaret was never softened. Margaret arrived quietly, almost invisibly, her presence subtle and insistent like a shadow stretching across a sunlit room. She never yelled. She never insulted. She never overtly demanded. And that made her presence unbearable because it seeped into every corner, claiming space that Emma had spent years carving out. The first evening, Emma brought flowers, pink chrysanthemums, soft and delicate, and she placed them in a vase with trembling hands, hoping the gesture would signal her goodwill, her willingness to coexist. Margaret looked at them for a long moment and then said, calmly, almost conversationally, "Chrysanthemums are usually for funerals." Emma forced a smile. I didn't know." Margaret's expression didn't change. But in that still, small reaction, Emma felt the first sting of what would become daily ritual. Her self-doubt, her small failures, her life quietly rewritten by someone else. The days that followed were filled with these small battles, invisible and meticulous. The food was first. Emma spent hours in the kitchen, kneading dough, stirring sauces, chopping vegetables, tasting, adjusting, trying to create warmth in every meal. And each morning she would find her work undone, the evidence of care tossed aside. "The soup spoiled," Margaret would say in her calm, unhurried tone. "You probably didn't cover it properly." Emma learned quickly not to argue. Soup doesn't spoil overnight. Cookies don't vanish into the ether. And yet every explanation Margaret offered was plausible, gentle, reasonable, impossible to dispute. Daniel never questioned it. He ate the meals, listened politely, and moved on. Then came the laundry. Emma had a system: whites separate, colors separate, delicates on gentle cycle. But one morning, Daniel's crisp white shirt came out tinted soft pink, a hue so gentle it could have been called pastel. Emma stared at it, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the fabric. "It must have been the color," Margaret said breezily. "You're always so distracted, Emma." "I notice it." Daniel looked at Emma, then at the shirt. "It's fine," he said quietly. Nothing was ever fine. It all added up. Red socks hidden in the laundry, small personal items misplaced, cosmetics vanished. And always the same narrative. Emma was forgetful, careless, overly sensitive, the source of all minor household chaos. And Daniel, silent or quiet, absorbed Margaret's versions of the story, leaving Emma to hold her frustration alone, folding it neatly into the corners of her life. Time passed, long and relentless. Emma stopped trying to prove herself. She stopped speaking up. She watched Daniel from the kitchen doorway as he laughed politely at Margaret's subtle jabs, as he offered to make her tea, as he allowed this quiet invasion of their life. Then came the letter. A promotion. A transfer. Another city. A new life beyond Margaret's reach. The decision was immediate. This was the salvation Emma had been waiting for, though she had never dared to hope it could arrive so simply, so suddenly. Daniel agreed without hesitation, almost too easily, as though he had been waiting for the same release, the same chance to reclaim the life they had lost. For a while, the apartment felt theirs again. The food stayed put. The laundry remained the correct color. Cosmetics stayed where they belonged. And the quiet, the small victories of normality were intoxicating. Emma laughed more freely, and Daniel watched her with the same warmth that had brought them together in the first place. Then the call came. Margaret was coming for a checkup. A few days. She would need their space, their attention, their accommodation. Emma waited. She didn't panic. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply prepared, as she had learned to prepare, with resolve, with quiet steel beneath the surface. When the door opened that evening and Margaret stepped forward as if the apartment were still hers, Emma stopped her, standing straight, shoulders back, and said with clarity that had taken years to cultivate, "No, you are not staying here." And this time, there was no hesitation, no wavering. Daniel's eyes met hers, and she saw relief, recognition, and maybe, finally, understanding. He reached for the phone. "I'll call a hotel for her," he said. "Just 10 minutes from the clinic." Margaret protested, loudly and insistently. Emma listened, calm and steady, letting Daniel manage the chaos with gentle authority. And for the first time in years, Emma felt it fully. The air in her lungs, the warmth of her home, the quiet pulse of her own life returning to her hands. She sank slowly to the hallway floor afterward, exhausted. And yet it was the first time exhaustion felt like something she had earned, not something imposed. Daniel returned quietly, took her hand, and said softly, "You did the right thing." And in that moment, surrounded by the calm of their reclaimed home, Emma realized that the battle had never been about food or socks or misplaced items. It had been about claiming her life, her space, her right to exist fully in the place she called home.